So we're continuing in this series, Firm Foundation, where we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. And so last week we looked at just the very beginning of the sermon in Matthew chapter 5, famously called the Beatitudes. And we kind of just saw that the Beatitudes is really just painting a portrait of who Jesus wants us to be. And so this week we're going to just move to the very next text in Matthew 5. One of the most recent scandals that has happened in the past few years has been the defamation trial between Johnny Depp and his ex-wife Amber Heard. I'm sure many of you know Johnny Depp for playing famous roles such as Captain Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Willy Wonka in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Edward Scissorhands in the movie Edward Scissorhands. He's a pretty famous guy. In 2016, his wife Amber Heard divorced him and claimed that it was for domestic violence reasons. And then just 2 years later, she published an article in the Washington Post basically just talking about how just all these issues of domestic violence. And after that, Depp began to lose brand deals. He lost movies. Pirates of the Caribbean cut him off. He was in some other movies that cut him off. And he just started to lose all this money because of it. You may know the rapper Kanye West, who has recently been in a similar situation. He said some comments that we'll call not so nice, and a lot of people and a lot of brands and a lot of businesses have now cut him off because of that. These people get cut off from these brands, from these businesses, because in some ways they act as a representative. If Johnny Depp is acting as a representative of Disney when he plays Captain Jack Sparrow, but now all of a sudden his name is tied to possibly hurting and beating his wife, that doesn't look good on Disney. If you have someone like Kanye, who's a representative of Adidas, who makes his famous shoes, and he's accused of saying these not super nice things that I won't even repeat here, you don't want to be represented that way. In similar ways, if you identify as a Christian, you are actually a representative of Christ. If you are a born-again Christ follower, you represent Christ. In his second letter to the Corinthian church, Paul actually tells them that we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. There's something profound about what Paul is saying. In everyday life, we are ambassadors of Christ. We're representatives of him. We wear his jersey. In the everyday struggles, we should be representing Christ. We should be acting as his ambassadors. And like ambassadors that represent the companies of our world, Christ wants us to represent his brand well. Here's the key thing that I'm going to ask you to take away from today. Christians must stand out from the world. We know that Christ came to flip the world upside down. In the way that the world acts, Christ comes in and he says that my people will be different. Therefore, if we're going to represent him well, we must act different from the world. And I think that's what our text today is going to help show us. So we're continuing in Matthew 5 with the passage that is often referred to as the salt and light. Before we do that, I want to reiterate a few things. Remember that we're still at the very beginning of this sermon. If the Beatitudes were Jesus' hook for the sermon to just kind of draw you in, his speech on the salt and light is really this felt need to the audience. He's telling them, here's why you should listen. And so, as we read this text, I want you to keep in mind that his audience doesn't know what Jesus is going to say next. If you've read through Matthew a little bit, you probably know the kind of topics that Jesus is going to deal with in the Sermon on the Mount. But at this point in the sermon, they have no clue what he's going to talk about. All they've heard is the Beatitudes. So although we can try to read things into it, try to read this text as if you're just there listening to this like the audience for the very first time. So let's go ahead and read our text for today, Matthew 5, 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father is one of my favorite passages in the New Testament, because I think this plays a major role for how we should be viewing ourselves as representatives, as ambassadors of Christ. Although Jesus is stating his case through the use of these illustrations, I don't think it's really too hard to get at, or to understand what he's getting at. So let's start breaking it down a little bit. The first verse of it, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus starts off this section with a bold statement that you are the salt of the earth. Some interesting effects that this might have on a crowd. I mean, if I told you that you are the church, there's no question about that. I mean, this is happening right now. Jesus doesn't say you were the salt, you will be the salt, you might be the salt, you might so happen to be the salt in a future time, not right now set. No, right now you are the salt of the earth. Jesus tells the crowd that they are the salt of the earth. Then he asks them a question. If salt loses its saltiness, can it be made salty again? Kind of a rhetorical question. Obviously the answer seems to be no. If salt loses its saltiness, it's no longer good at making things saltier. Now I've done my research, and Google told me that salt is actually a very stable compound, which makes it very hard for it to lose its saltiness. So then after turning to an actual book, what I learned is that most scholars of the first century think that what they used back then is different than what we have now for salt. It was just kind of something that formed around the Dead Sea, and they just picked it up and it helped make your food taste a little bit better. So they called it salt, but not the same thing we have today, so they actually do think that it could lose its saltiness. And so, while it loses its saltiness, what's it good for? Nothing. If it loses its saltiness, if salt loses its saltiness, the one thing that it's purpose to do is not good for anything anymore. Jesus says that it's good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. In the Gospel of Luke, and kind of a parallel passage of this text, it's even a little more harsh, where Jesus says it is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. I mean, this salt is good for nothing if it isn't salty. So just as the effectiveness of salt relies on its saltiness, an effective Christian relies on its Christ-likeness. When Christians begin to look less like Christ, they're less effective Christians, and therefore they lose their influence. In the Christian sphere, they're not useful. They're not salty anymore. And that may seem kind of harsh. I don't want you to mishear me. I'm not saying that when people begin to stop looking like Jesus, that they're useless as people. I'm just saying that regardless of how good of a Christian you are or not, we are made in the image of God. Therefore, we are useful as people. We were a good idea when God made us. But just in the Christian sphere, it's the ability of doing Christian ministry. And if you do not look like Christ, your effectiveness in that goes down. Just in the same way where it would be silly of me to ask someone to make me dinner when they've never cooked in their life. It would be silly of me to ask someone who's never even owned a car or ever even touched a car to come and fix my car. It's not that they're useless as people, just for the task at hand, they're not useful. They're not salty enough. So if you're looking less and less like Christ rather than more, if you're losing your saltiness, you're losing your effectiveness towards the Christian mission, because Christians must stand out from the world. So if us as Christians are indistinguishable from everyone else, then we're not salty. We're useless to the Christian mission, because Jesus wants us to stand out. He wants us to be the salt of the earth. But let's assume you're salty. If you're working to look more and more like Christ, then what does Jesus desire for you? One of the things that salt is used for is preservation. So when things begin to decay, such as fish or meat, you throw salt on it, and it would help to just kind of slow the decaying process. And this is our call as Christians. We live in a dying world. You're fooling yourself if you think that any number amount of Christians and any number amount of churches can completely eliminate the decay the world faces. The corruption, the scandals, the moral failures, and everything in between. The world is decaying, and Christ calls us to be salt. He calls us to act to slow this decaying process. We likely cannot stop the decay. We cannot kiss the world, put a Band-Aid on it, give it a good old attaboy, and send it on its way. When Jesus tells us that we are the salt of the earth, he's designated his people as the restraint on the sinful society that we live in. This is a great call. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues telling his audience, after telling them that they're the salt of the earth, which you would think would be enough to kind of fuel the evangelism fire in them, he keeps talking, and he tells them, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In John chapter 8, Jesus will famously say, come on, do your thing. There we go. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So as I think of these two verses together, and I think of Jesus calls himself the light of the world, and then here in Matthew, he says that you are the light of the world. Once again, I can't help but notice how Jesus wants us to look similar to him. Jesus is the light of the world, who shines because of the gospel truth. And he'll shine because of his sacrifice on the cross and resurrection from the grave. But now Jesus tells us that we are the light of the world. That should motivate us to begin to look, or to try to look, more like Jesus. It's an important thing that we understand who the light is for. It's for everyone. It's not just a few people. It's not just the people you're friends with, not just for the people at church, not just the people you like. The light is for everyone. And then Jesus gives us these two little short illustrations, a city on a hill and a light under a bowl. And these seem like pretty simple ideas. If there's a city on a hill, it's hard to hide. I think of as you're heading towards Orlando, once you get within like a 200-mile radius of Disney, you'll start seeing signs for it. I mean, you don't have to have a GPS to get to Disney. Everything is there for you. You start seeing signs. Once you start getting closer, you can start seeing some of the attractions and the castle. And that place doesn't even sit on a hill, because we don't have this here in Florida. But Disney World is pretty hard to hide. In the same way, Jesus says that people should not put a light under a bowl. It's just silly. Terry, can you put your hand in front of that projector for me? Whoa, guys, look at all these slides that I have. Right? Like there's a light there, but it might as well just be turned off. Because if you're covering it, it's useless. Thank you. The light is pretty useless if it's covered. These two illustrations, the city on the hill and the covered light, I think convey an important truth. That if you are representing Christ, if you are a Christian who is growing in your faith, then Jesus is saying it should be impossible to hide the truth that you know. It would almost be comical to do so, he says. Why? Because Christians must stand out from the world. And we see this ultimately conveyed in the final verse of this section, Matthew 5:16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. There's a famous saying that actions speak louder than words. I often think of this phrase in terms of relationships. How do you know that someone loves you? Is it simply because they just say that they do? If your significant other just says that they love you, but never seems to act like it, do you really think that they love you? If your mother or father just says that they love you, but never seems to act like it, would you believe them? Probably not. And you can kind of flip this the other way. Do you know that someone loves you even if they don't say it? Even if they never say the words, I love you, can they do things? Can they influence you in a way that you just know that they care about you, that they love you? Actions speak louder than words. Take this a step further. How do I know that Jesus loves me? For the Bible tells me so is the correct answer. Okay, that's great, but let's say I'm mildly skeptical about the Bible. How do I know that Jesus loves me? Because Jesus sacrificed himself for me. Jesus never has to say, Evan, I love you. Because I know that he allowed himself to die on my behalf. And that's true of every single one of us. He died the death that I deserved. And that's a type of love that cannot be conveyed through words. I think that Jesus is getting at the same concept in this passage. How will people know that we are Christians? Because we carry a Bible around everywhere? Because we can't commit to Sunday morning plans because we're going to be at church? Because we can post Bible verses on our social media? How do people know that we're Christians?
By our action.
The way that we act. Or to use the words of Jesus, the way that we let our light shine. And how are we supposed to act? Well, Jesus is going to tell us. I mean, that's what the rest of the sermon is going to deal with. He's going to tell us how to act in all these different ways. He's going to talk about murder, the anger in our heart, and he's going to encourage us to settle matters with others. He's going to talk about adultery, and he's going to encourage us to not look at people lustfully. He's going to talk about divorce, encouraging us to stay in relationships. He's going to talk about oaths, and actually encourage us not to make them. He's going to tell us to turn our other cheek to those who hit us. He's going to tell us to love our enemies. He's going to tell us to give to the needy. He's going to tell us how to pray, how to fast. He's going to tell us how to deal with how we should interact with money. He's going to encourage us not to worry. He's going to tell us to not judge others. He's going to tell us to do to others what you would want done to you. There's your summary of the entire Sermon on the Mount. And yet in this passage, Jesus tells us that people shine, we as Christians shine, because they see our deeds. And the deeds that he's talking about is this sermon. Jesus is giving his audience the keys to the kingdom. He's telling them how in nearly every aspect of life, this is how you should live. This is how you will glorify God. But let's talk about it a little bit more tangibly. In the day-to-day life, how do we shine for Jesus? I'm going to give you just one verse, 3 things. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Although these are not the words of Jesus, I certainly think that James has a pretty good summary of everything that Jesus would want us to know. If we're going to shine as Christians, we must be quick to listen. As I'm sure many of you know, most people, when they're going through something difficult, they just need someone to listen to them. They just need a shoulder to cry on, someone to sit with them. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is to just be quiet. If you're like me, I look at situations and I just naturally, I want to fix them. Whenever Katie and I have a conversation, if she starts to complain about something, I often ask, is this a listening conversation or a fixing conversation? Because because this is important. Because sometimes it's just about listening. Just by learning to close my mouth, I shine just a little bit brighter for Christ in my marriage. And this is true of many aspects in life. In customer service, the famous saying is, the customer is always right. And we know that that's not always true, but the goal is to make them feel that way. I worked at Batteries Plus for just under a year, and the interesting thing about that store, which I'm sure Jeremy you can relate to, is that people don't just come in to browse. Like, you don't walk into a battery store that sells car batteries and other car parts, and we fix phone screens and stuff. Like, you don't just walk in there to browse. The type of people that walk in are people who are already upset. They had a car crap out on them and they need a new battery. They dropped their phone and now they can't do anything and so they need a new screen. These people are already upset. And in those situations, the best thing that I can do is just listen. Yes, I've made plenty of people upset during my time at Batteries Plus because we didn't have a part in or we couldn't get it in a certain amount of time. But I helped people the best I could by just being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. The church needs to embody this verse. The church should be quick to listen to everyone. We should be quick to listen to everyone from every type of background, no matter what they've done, no matter how they've acted. We should be willing to listen to them. We should be slow to speak. It's overwhelming the amount of people I've seen who want nothing to do with Christianity because of just a few Christians who've said some terrible things. Terrible things that if they had thought about it for more than 2 seconds, they probably wouldn't have said. If we're going to speak as representatives, as ambassadors of Christ, we need to think very carefully about what we're going to say. And sometimes the best answer is, I don't know. Or to just be silent. Along with that, being slow to get angry is an important part of being representatives of Christ. If we as Christians get angry and upset at every little thing that happens, we don't represent Jesus well. If you get angry and you begin to spread hate, we don't represent Jesus well. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. I think that if you do these 3 things, partnered with everything that we'll talk about in the Sermon on the Mount, then you're on your way to being a good representative of Christ. But with that, however, I think it's important to clarify why all of this is important. We've spent an entire sermon talking about how Christians are supposed to act differently from the world. They're supposed to act like salt. They're supposed to shine their light. But why? Well, Jesus tells us. To glorify your Father in heaven. Doing the good deeds, being the salt and light, all has the purpose of glorifying our Father in heaven. Towards the very beginning of his ministry, he will say that all your good deeds in representing Christ well is to glorify God. Towards the end of Jesus' ministry, he will actually tell his disciples, if you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. It is to God's glory that we produce good fruit. It is to God's glory that we are disciples of Christ and that we represent him well. Because when we do, we shine bright and far, and we impact more people than we could have ever imagined. All because we just remained salty. We remained useful to the Christian mission, and we let our light shine. Because we know that Christians must stand out from the world. On February 19th, 1968, the first episode of a show aired that would last for over 33 years. The show starred a Presbyterian minister who has been described as a televangelist to toddlers. I'm of course talking about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, starring Fred Rogers. If you didn't know, Fred Rogers was actually a pretty firm believer, and he was an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, something that he kept up throughout all his time on the show. On his show, Mr. Rogers never really talked about his faith. He actually never really talked about it at all. He is quoted by saying, you don't need to speak overtly about religion in order to get a message across. He believed that teaching through example could be just as powerful as preaching. And the core message that he wanted to get across to all the children watching was that they are loved just the way. And even in that message, you can begin to hear the Christian background. Rogers believed that if he offered his television show in good faith, God would do the work necessary so people could receive the grace they needed. I think Mr. Rogers is a great example of someone who shined for Christ. Someone who didn't try to spread his faith by imposing it on people or shoving it down their throat. Instead, he just lived by actions. And he tried to teach children to do the same. And so even though Mr. Rogers may have never talked about grace or the grace and love of Christ on the air, I certainly think that he acted well as the salt of the earth and the light of the world to children all around the world. I mean, this show ended many years ago now, and it's still a show that I know that I've seen and I know children today have seen because of how much of an impact it has. Christian or not, the show that Rogers produced was one full of grace, truth, and love. He didn't have to talk about religion for you to know what he valued. Because like a city on a hill, his faith shined through him, and it couldn't be hidden. Mr. Rogers was certainly no perfect person, something that I'm sure he himself would tell you. So I don't want you to think like I'm holding him up as the perfect example. However, he's someone who took the opportunities put before him, and he was able to show Christ. So as we go out today, I challenge you to do the same. I challenge you to find opportunities to show the love of Christ. I challenge you to take advantage of the opportunities that God has placed in front of you. Opportunities to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Opportunities to stand out from the world. Would you guys pray with me? God, we thank you for this day. God, we're so thankful that you've called us to be representatives of you. God, we know that we do not deserve to wear your jersey. And God, you've entrusted us with the great task of representing you, and to be the salt of the earth, and to be the light in this world. God, we know that this world needs a lot of salt and it needs a lot of light, because it's decaying and it's full of darkness. So God, I pray that you would fuel our hearts and fuel just our desire to fulfill the mission, to make disciples. God, I'm so grateful that you've called us to be your representatives. And God, I'm thankful that we can do all this because of the sacrifice of your Son, who died on the cross to show that you truly loved us. God, we're so thankful for all that you do, and we ask all this in your holy and precious name.